It's time for a little face-off. Delta Unisaw, Powermatic 66. Two classic machines in any vintage shop. So we'll do a little comparison, just sort of a rundown of the differences and distinctions between these two classics. We'll start with just a little bit about external appearance and exterior cabinets to start with. Both seem to be made of about the same gauge stamped sheet metal cabinets. Obviously, this is a very early Delta Unisaw, 1939 to be exact, with these 4 cast iron feet. That design changed eventually to a cast iron plinth and then a sheet metal plinth. This Powermatic 66 is the first iteration of the 66, just like this is the first iteration of the Delta Unisaw. And you can see here they were using a stamped sheet metal plinth for even the earliest of the Powermatic 66s. They did make a Powermatic 65 for a few years, which had a cast iron plinth, but none of the Powermatic 66s had that. So as far as external goes, obviously very similar appearance, dust door on the front of both. The early Delta Unisaws did have a floor pan, sort of a false bottom, whereas the Powermatic 66s did not ever have that. Obviously that can be added in very easily with a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood or MDF or sheet metal. Other exterior things, one of the biggest differences is switch location, and this does make a big sort of ergonomic difference for actual use. The switch on the Delta Unisaws is on the right hand side, the switch for the Powermatic 66 is on the left hand side, and for most uses this is more convenient, right? With a left hand switch, as you're pushing material through, if you got into a jam or a bind or something, you could hit the switch with your left hand without having to move your hand down to turn the switch off. So that is one of the convenient factors of having a left-hand switch, which the Powermatic 66 has had from the beginning. As far as other external things, a little more style, obviously, with the Delta Unisaw. Powermatic is more sort of industrial looking. Okay, now we'll move on to tabletops. You can see the tabletops here in the background. This one here that obviously still needs a lot of work is the Powermatic 66, and this one here is the Delta Unisaw. The Powermatic 66 is 1 inch bigger in each direction. Okay, 1 inch bigger in each direction. Okay, so there's a little bit about the externals and the tabletops. Now we'll get into internal parts. Okay, so here we are with the internals of the Delta Unisaw. We can see here the trunnions and trunnion brackets, front and back. We can see here the arbor bracket and the 3-belt pulley, and the arbor goes through this casting here. And there's a bearing on each side of the pulley. Here we have what's called the yoke, and then the motor bracket, which hangs down to the motor here. Probably the biggest difference here we'd notice is the fact that obviously this is a right tilt. Unisaws were right tilt, whereas Powermatic 66s were left tilt. Okay, we'll go over to the internals on the Powermatic 66. Alright, here we can see similar trunnion setup with front and back. These early trunnions on the first iteration of the Powermatic 66 spanned from side to side, and that continued into the 1970s. Eventually in the late 70s and into the 80s, they eventually changed the trunnion design to really just be this part here, and it bolted right here. And in the back as well was just this semicircular portion. They got rid of these bigger brackets that go all the way to the side. Some of the big differences here on the internals is the way the motor is mounted. Obviously, first off, it's a left tilt saw, not a right tilt as far as the blade goes. But the mounting bracket is very different, and the arbor design. Okay, so we saw on the Unisaw that there was a bearing and then the pulley with the belts and then another bearing, whereas the Powermatic 66 is designed where you have both of your bearings with a spacer inside this casting and then your pulley on this side. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about hand wheels and locking knobs. Obviously the hand wheels are very similar. Both are very smooth in operation for tilt and elevation when cleaned and lubed properly, all the internal parts and so forth. But I did want to mention just a slight difference on the lock knobs. Both use a similar setup, a threaded pin with sort of a point on the end that creates friction inside the shaft with either a key or in this case 2 bullets on the Delta Unisaw. But just as in use, it does make a slight difference. The Powermatic ones are a lot easier to spin, so that can actually save some time when you're tightening or loosening, right? It's a lot easier than these Delta ones, which don't just their design, you can't really get them spinning fast. You have to manually make each turn, you know, to get to that point, right? This part isn't big enough to create enough spinning mass, I think that's what the issue is. Whereas these, once they're loose, then you can just boom, you know, and you can do the same thing. You can tighten that down, and then you're ready to go. So again, slight difference. Obviously not a deal breaker one way or the other, but this is quicker in use to snug these up because you can just sort of spin it with your hand and get it going. Overall footprint on the cabinets, similar to the tabletops, the Powermatic cabinet is slightly bigger in both directions as far as the footprint dimensions of the cabinet itself. And then we could certainly talk about motors. The original Unisaws used what were called repulsion induction bullet motors, which came at first way back in 39. You could get a 3/4 horse, one horse, and I think 1.5 horse. As the Unisaw, you know, continued its long prolific run, they eventually, you know, offered different motor sizes. You know, they got rid of the 3/4 horse, and then they offered the 1 and the 1.5 horse, and then eventually they went away from the bullet style repulsion induction motors and offered then, you know, additional horsepower, 2 horsepower, 3 horsepower, and so forth. The early Powermatics were 1.5 horse, 2 horse, and 3 horse. Again, you could get different motor specs on these, obviously single phase, 3-phase, and different motor sizes. But Powermatic never, since their company came about later when it comes to table saws, as far as I'm aware of, they never used any you know, repulsion induction style motors. It was more traditional capacitor single phase motors, and then obviously just normal 3-phase motors. Okay, so let's see what else we got here. Now let's talk a little bit about original fences that were on the Powermatic 66 and the Delta Unisaw. The Powermatic 66 fence is seen here, and the Delta Unisaw fence is seen here. Just point of clarification, this Delta Unisaw fence is not period correct for the original 39 Delta Unisaw. The design here was a little bit different. Originally it was called a microset fence. There was a little knob here you had to tighten to get the back of the fence to engage. This is a later version called the jet lock, where they created all that front and back lock from this one knob rather than having you know, a thumb screw here and then a lever here. Both the original Delta microset and jet lock fences have a micro adjust, as does the Powermatic 66 fence. The Powermatic 66 fence gets a locking mechanism on front and back with 2 separate levers here, as you can see. And besides that, very similar design. They run on round rails, both the original Unisaw fence and the Powermatic 66 fence. The biggest difference by far is the heft. The Powermatic 66 fence is extremely heavy, and that is because all of this is cast iron. Okay, this is a cast iron machined fence, and this is sheet metal. Okay, so this additional heft and mass here is the big difference. Both, besides that, are very similar in operation. I will say, when it comes to replacement parts, we probably have to go with the Unisaw. The Unisaw was so prolific. They made so many of them for so long that finding replacement parts is pretty easy. I've actually built a whole Unisaw from parts on eBay, just sort of to prove that point. The only thing I had was an empty cabinet. I had no parts, nothing internal, no knobs, no, you know, hand wheels, no nothing. And I took that empty cabinet and I purchased all parts off of eBay from different sellers and really created a Franken Unisaw, if you will, Frankenstein saw, and worked great, no problems at all. So yeah, replacement parts definitely easier to find for the Unisaw because there were so many more of them made. It's not to say you can't find Powermatic replacement parts. You certainly can. It might take a little bit more time, a little more looking on eBay or other sources, but it can be done. From my own experience, I've probably worked on, we're probably getting to about 30 or more Unisaws and about 10 Powermatic 66s. So that just gives you, you know, a sense of which ones come available more frequently and so forth as well. Definitely more of these out there. I don't know how many times I've got the question, which one is better, the Unisaw or the Powermatic 66? So let me just go through some of the pros and cons. Certainly both are excellent machines, and in many ways it's a question sort of like, is a Ford truck F-150 or a Chevy 1500 a better truck, right? They're both basically in the same category offering the same service and so forth. So in this case, obviously, they're both 10-inch table saws designed with the same capacities and so forth in large part. The Powermatic is a little bit heftier, probably 50 to 100 pounds more weight when all said and done. As I said, the tabletop's an inch bigger in each dimension. The internal parts maybe are a bit heftier, but certainly not nearly as elegant. The Unisaw definitely wins the design question, hands down. Such beautiful Art Deco styling. It's a timeless design, really a piece of art. Some of the things that, distinctions that probably in my opinion would cause me to favor a Powermatic 66. First off, it's a left tilt blade, which in my opinion is a little easier to work with and some would argue safer. The left mount switch also is an improvement in my opinion, just as far as when you're actually using the saw, you can hit the switch with your left hand. Obviously you could remount the Unisaw switch on the other side, but we're talking about as purchased or as designed. And again, this different lock knob, just the ability to sort of spin that with your hand, again, not a big deal at all, but a slight difference that speeds up things a little bit when you're locking those. And I would say as well with the Powermatics, the Powermatic 66 uses a traditional face mount motor, so there are some additional motor replacement options in comparison to the Unisaw, which really is a proprietary motor mount, or something you have to get a specific Unisaw motor replacement, or have a adapter plate fabricated or something like that. Certainly much more could be said about these, with doing tolerances and run out, at the blade and all arbor run out and all those types of things. I'm not going to get into that because Wood Magazine did a great in-depth test of table saws in 1997, which is when the Unisaw and the Powermatic 66 were still being made, still very high quality. And so I'll add a few pictures of this in the video, some of the tests they did and comparisons between the Unisaw and the Powermatic 66 and some other saws as well. So again, much more could be said. Hopefully this at least gives you a little bit of a start, as again, it's a question I've gotten many times. This will at least get you started on digging into the differences between the Unisaw and the Powermatic 66. As far as access to manuals, vintagemachinery.org has tons of manuals for both, tons of pictures of both, and then owwm.org has tons of postings and threads on both machines where you see this question asked a bunch of times as well. So there you have it. Hopefully something there is helpful.
So now let's take a look at some of the highlights from Wood Magazine's August of 1997 cabinet-style table saws review, where they looked at the Powermatic 66 and the Delta Unisaw, which were both still American-made at that point, and then also Jet and Grizzly and General and some other brands as well. They looked at the internal parts. They talked about the worm gear design, and Powermatic has a slight edge here. They were the only one at that point that was using a concave ground gear design. And then they also looked at the box-style trunnion carriage versus the yoke-style trunnion carriage. The Powermatic has a box style and the Delta has a yoke style, just a difference there. And then all of the clones, sort of the Taiwanese brands, have used either one of those as well. They also ran a lot of tests as far as tolerances and run out, and both the Unisaw and the Powermatic performed well, although they did give the slight edge to the Powermatic overall for a variety of factors. This was a great review that summarized the differences, and hopefully this video can help you dig into whether you want to get a Unisaw or a Powermatic. Both are great options and have that vintage flair as well.